Hello, my name is Kate Redshaw and I'm Head of Practice Development in the Employment team at Burgess Salmon. And I'm joined today by one of our partners, Luke Barry. Hi, Luke. It's good to have you back in the hot seat.
Hi, Kate. Very good to be here. Thank you.
So, Luke, today we're going to be talking about the cost of living crisis, something which is, of course, high on many employers' agendas. And indeed, we know that many employers have been keen to put in place support for their staff to help them through these difficult times. And while some commentators are talking more positively about the economic forecast longer term, certainly in the coming months, the tough times are expected to continue. Now, at the end of last year, we put together a guide which is available free of charge on the Burgess Salmon website, which gives information about some of the different ways in which employers can put in place support for their people. And we wrote that based on what we were hearing from clients and the market more generally. So, Luke, what I'd like to do today is to pick out a couple of initiatives that we mention in the guide and talk about them in a bit more detail. The first initiative I want to discuss is one which we know has been popular, and that's how employers can make one-off lump sums to workers. And the second one I want to cover relates to employees who want to take up second jobs. And we know that people are looking to do this. There's some recent research by the Office for National Statistics, which is showing that the number of people taking up second jobs to supplement their income is rising. And then, Luke, what I'd like to do is to finish with some pithy tips, which is not easy to say, from you as to the things employers ought to be thinking about kind of more widely when they're putting these types of measures in place. So no pressure, but you have been warned. But before we get it stuck into the detail, how are you seeing employers responding to this situation, in general terms?
Well, in a wide variety of ways, I think, Kate. As you've said, we do know many employers have been proactive in trying to offer support where they can, noting, of course, the constraints and difficulties many people are operating in at the current time. Some because they believe it's the right thing to do, others perhaps with an eye to trying to retain their staff. And we know in certain sectors that's been very challenging recently. And we've seen a wide range of interventions. So the obvious one would be for those who can afford it, offering higher than normal salary increases. But we've seen employers looking to review pay more frequently, so perhaps 6 monthly as opposed to annually. We've seen some employers looking to bring forward their pay review dates. We've seen
Sorry, Luke, to interrupt you, but can I just stop you there? Because that's an interesting one, isn't it? Bringing forward the implementation date for pay rises, because that strikes me as something that I guess is reasonably straightforward to do.
Yes, you're right. I think it can be pretty straightforward, and it could be a good option for employers who aren't in a position to offer a high percentage pay rise, because it allows them to do something positive financially for their employees. The employees obviously getting their pay rise sooner than they ordinarily would. But I think there's still challenges. So with inflation so high, I think it may still be difficult to manage employee expectation. And you then also got the question of what you would do in the following year if you brought your pay review forward this year. But to go back to what I was saying in terms of other wider interventions, you'll have seen this in the press, I'm sure, but we've seen many employers looking to pay bonuses, one-off cost of living payments, and in some cases, even setting up hardship funds for those employees most in need. And I think my view would be that whilst inflation remains high, employers are going to continue to look at ways they can support, but it is difficult for employers. They're facing very significant cost pressures themselves, as we know. So to keep offering financial support is challenging. And because of that, I do suspect some employers may start to look at less expensive and more creative ways in which they might be able to continue to provide support to their employees.
Yes, that's really interesting, Luke, and we'll go on to look at one of those sort of more creative suggestions shortly. But firstly, let's talk about employers who want to make one-off payments to staff, as we've seen a number of employers look to do this. And on the face of it, this can seem like a really good way of providing support in a reasonably straightforward manner, but actually there are some nuances which we've certainly come across, which as an employer you'd be well advised to think about in advance before you make the payments.
Yep, you're right. There are a number of points to consider. I think the most obvious and the first one should be thinking about who's actually going to receive the payments. So, given the financial pressures businesses are under, as we've discussed, I think many employers are looking to target those one-off payments at those most in need. They don't want to offer a blanket approach and make payments across the board. On the face of it, that looks fine, very sensible. But if you do take this approach, I think you need to think carefully how you do it. So, for example, if you set a qualification threshold based on a salary level, so i.e., if you earn less than X pounds per year, you'll be entitled to a payment. We've seen that this can look a bit arbitrary and also may upset those employees who earn just above the threshold. So it might just be worth thinking if there are other ways to do that. So could you base payments based on role or grade, for example? And if you can't do that, maybe we've seen some employers think about this, offering a taper for the support so you don't have that all or nothing effect.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And just thinking it through, employers are also going to need to decide how they apply any thresholds to part-time workers. That's something else we've seen come up. For example, I'm thinking of a part-time worker whose full-time pay equivalent is just above the threshold, say. If the actual pay the part-timer receives is below the threshold, employers are going to need to decide whether they should still receive the payment.
Yep, it goes back to targeting maybe who are those most in need. And those are exactly the sorts of issues you need to be thinking about in advance of making any announcement. Similar issue arises when you're thinking about employees on maternity leave, family leave, or sick leave. Like your part-time example, those employees may earn above the threshold whilst at work, but maybe well below the threshold whilst they're on leave. I don't think there's a right or wrong approach to dealing with these questions. You do have to think about the risk of discrimination claims, of course, for those on maternity, family leave in particular. But my advice would be to really sense check who will and won't receive the payment under your proposal in some detail. Consider whether you're really happy with that, and also importantly, how you would justify your decision making if you were challenged. And if you've got any concerns, seek out the relevant advice in advance of implementation.
Yep, always a good idea to take legal advice, Luke. Another example I know we've seen is for employers to calculate the sum as a percentage of salary and then apply a cap to the maximum amount that will be paid. And, that's quite good because it means you can target the support to those who are most in need whilst ensuring that nobody is excluded completely. In any event, whatever approach you do decide to take, it's probably worth putting together a list of FAQs, because actually, as well as those being useful for the employees, in drafting those FAQs, it's also going to be helpful for you in terms of flushing out any potential problems and working out what you're going to do about those in advance. So before we move on, it is worth flagging that there is more guidance for employers considering making one-off payments in our guide. Now, the next area I want to discuss with you, Luke, is changes employers might be able to make which won't necessarily have a hard cost attached. So, for example, one thing employers can consider is possibly allowing employees to flex their hours, which might help them reduce childcare or travel costs. But an area, as we mentioned in the introduction, an area I want to look at in a bit more detail is second jobs. Now, we know that lots of employees are already working really long hours in a bid to supplement their income, but there will still be employees, and the ONS research bears that out, who want to take up second jobs. But actually, Luke, many employment contracts include standard wording which prohibit people from working for another employer. So should employers be relaxing those provisions? And if they do, the employment lawyer in me thinks there are probably a number of questions that might need to be resolved first.
Yep, well, I think the employment lawyer in you is probably correct, Kate.
Only probably.
Well, what I mean is I don't, there are some issues, but I don't think they're insurmountable. I think they're pretty easily resolved. And also, don't forget that these relaxations can be put in place on a temporary basis. They don't need to be permanent changes to terms and conditions or whatever. I think what I would say is that you probably want to think about putting a few parameters in place around any relaxation. And there's more detail again in the guide, but in brief, I think you'd certainly want to require the employee to let you know if they take on a second job, and I suspect make it subject to you getting or them getting your express prior consent. I think you'd also want to get information from the employer, oblige them to tell you about the hours and the nature of the role of any second job. That's to enable you to ensure you continue to comply with your own working time regulations, obligations. So, for example, the 48-hour working week, but also any wider health and safety requirements and obligations you might have. I also just think it's worth thinking about the optics of allowing or encouraging employees to have second jobs, and how that might potentially be played back to you in terms of the salary and benefits you're providing in their primary role. So these are all things you need to think about. It can be a difficult balancing act in terms of which way you go.
Yeah, no, that's all very sensible, Luke. And of course, if as the employer you're aware of an employee with a second job, it also enables you to assess any impact that the new role might have on your own business.
Well, that's right. I mean, they're points you'd like to think people will think through, but I think you want to make clear that it doesn't impact on the employee's ability to do their primary job. But wider than that, it's not going to impact on your own brand or reputation. And I think the final point, again, probably an obvious one, is that you don't really want your employees going off and working for your competitors, of course, particularly where that presents a real risk to you and your business. So you want to be making all of those points clear if you are going to think about a relaxation to your existing contractual provisions.
Yeah. Once again, good advice there, Luke. So, Luke, this has been a really interesting discussion, and it's been really helpful to look at a couple of those issues in a bit more detail. But before we finish up, I haven't forgotten the pithy tips. So, if you could just give us some of those, those overarching things that employers who are considering how to provide more support for their employees should be bearing in mind as they look to pull those kind of packages together, that would be great.
I will try my best, Kate. I'm on notice. I'll also give myself an immediate get out that there is more detail in the written guide. First point, I think, would be to take the time to gauge the financial need in your workforce and really try and identify what support is going to hit the mark the most. As we've seen, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and sometimes your assumptions don't reflect reality. I think if you've got friendly trade unions or employee representatives, canvass their views, see what they're seeing on the ground. Secondly, whilst we're talking about trade unions, if you're looking to amend or adjust pay review processes or implement changes to terms and conditions of employment, either temporary or permanent, you want to make sure you follow any relevant collective bargaining process, of course. Thirdly, we've touched on this, but if you're considering any sort of support or changes to employees' contracts, is that going to be temporary or permanent in nature? You want to be making that very clear to affected employees. Fourthly, worth mentioning a point which can be overlooked, I think, increased pay or benefits can potentially impact on some employees' eligibility for universal credit or tax credits. So you want to be liaising with those employees, making sure they understand the position and you responding accordingly. And then finally, a wider point, I think, is just to consider the implications of the support in the widest possible terms. And as part of that, really think through your communication strategy meticulously. That's to try and just make sure that your well-intentioned gestures of support are received in the way they're intended. We have seen some occasions, and every so often, a business make the wrong judgment call here. And I think the PR fallout can be pretty brutal. So those would be my key points. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, no, thanks, Luke. Those were really, really useful. That brings us to the end of our conversation, and I hope you found it useful. As I've mentioned, the guide for employers is on our website, so do take a look at that if you haven't seen it already. And if you have any specific queries on this topic, or indeed have any other employment law queries that you think we might be able to help you with, please do get in touch. Contact details will follow shortly. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.